Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds, airs Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, and is always available for your listening pleasure at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Thank you so much for joining me. I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Today on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, we're exploring the evolution of ideas. Joining me at my table, Stephen Johnson, widely regarded as one of the world's most perceptive and thought-provoking thinkers on new media and the evolution of information technology, and author of the new book and PBS TV series, How We Got to Now. Also on the show, Barbara Erenreich, author of a provocative new memoir, Living with a Wild God, a non-believer's search for the truth about everything. Both of my guests, by the way, will be joining me at the 31st Annual Miami Book Fair International, November 16th through 23rd in downtown Miami at Miami-Dade College. But before we begin, a brief message from our sponsors. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, on Blog Talk Radio, and be sure to visit us at our newest home on iHeartRadio. Today, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show is brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment. Listen to audiobooks whenever and wherever you want. If you want to listen to it, Audible has it. With over 150,000 titles in virtually every genre, you'll find what you're looking for. Get a free audiobook and 30-day trial today by signing up at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne, host of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds. Join me November 16th through 23rd at the nation's largest book fair, the 31st Miami Book Fair International in warm and sunny Miami at Miami-Dade College. Mingle with 400-plus authors from around the world, including Patricia Cornwell, Dave Barry, John Dean, Philip Margolin, Anne Rice, Elizabeth Nunez, and Joanna Rakoff. Listen to the authors read their own words, answer your questions, and autograph your books. For more information, visit MiamiBookFair.com and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. See you there. Hello, I'm Halli Casser-Jayne, host of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Join me Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern when I talk with the great artists, writers, musicians, politicians, and celebrities of our day. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is talk radio for fine minds. Tune in live or listen to the podcast at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Stephen Johnson is the best-selling author of 9 books, including Future Perfect, Where Good Ideas Come From, The Invention of Air, The Ghost Map, and Everything Bad is Good for You. The founder of a variety of influential websites, Johnson writes for Time, Wired, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal. He's widely regarded as one of the world's most perceptive and thought-provoking thinkers on new media and the evolution of information technology, and is the founder of a variety of influential websites. His latest best-selling book is How We Got to Now, 6 Innovations That Made the Modern World, which takes a look at the history of innovation and how there is something extraordinary in just about everything ordinary. The stories behind the remarkable ideas that made modern life possible are revealed, the unsung heroes that brought them into the world, and the unexpected and bizarre consequences each of these innovations has triggered, discussed, focusing on cold, time, light, clean, glass, and sound. How We Got to Now, also a 6-part PBS BBC television series hosted and co-created by the man who can boast 1.4 million Twitter followers. How We Got to Now, 6 Innovations That Made the Modern World, celebrates innovative thinking and explores the thought processes in particular instances of how we got from, so to speak, A to Z, or as your title puts it, How We Got to Now. So let's talk how you got to now. Give me a little background.
You want to hear it.
But some background that's relevant to this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is my ninth book, the first to have a television show kind of develop in parallel with it. And it's, I kind of looking back on it, all of my books in one way or another are about kind of new ideas taking form. Sometimes they're more historical studies of new ideas that were new 200 years ago, and sometimes they're about I wrote a book about neuroscience and kind of cutting-edge neuroscience and about today's popular culture and video games. But I've always been interested in kind of these new ideas and how they're kind of shaping society in one way or another, whether it's in the past or in the present. And about 4 years ago, I wrote this book called Where Good Ideas Come From that was looking at innovation in terms of kind of the patterns of innovation and people who were unusually creative or organizations that were unusually creative and good at coming up with new ideas. What can we learn from them? And that book did very nicely, and I did a TED Talk version of it. We did this little animated video for it that got viewed 4 million times on YouTube, and I gave a lot of talks around those themes. And so there's something that was clearly kind of working in the storytelling that was in that book. And so shortly after that book came out, Jane Root, this producer who'd been at Discovery and at the BBC, came to me and said, let's go to PBS and see if we can get them to do a show around these ideas and the history of innovation. And so that's how we started thinking about this structure of having kind of 6 objects that we now take for granted, but that have this fascinating history to them that goes back sometimes, 1,000 years. And then PBS liked the idea of that as the show, and so I began working kind of on the book and the show in parallel, more or less.
Fascinating. It's interesting to me that this book in and of itself, to my mind, is almost itself an invention. Putting together ideas is so inventive. I mean, who would have thought to go there, right? Except for you. Except for you.
Really, it's got this, particularly what I call in the book the hummingbird effect, where someone invents something in history and it sets off this chain reaction that they themselves never had occurred to them. They were trying to solve one local problem, but it ended up transforming some other part of society. So, air conditioning gets invented, and that ends up causing all these people to move to the Sun Belt, which changes the political map of America, which ends up being instrumental in getting Ronald Reagan elected president. That is a pretty clear. You're not really playing 6 Degrees with Kevin Bacon when you make those connections. They actually, they're pretty direct ones, actually. But, of course, when Willis Carrier was inventing air conditioning, that was not at all his idea to change American politics. And so thinking about the research of the book and then the presentation of it, and this is true for the show as well, those leaps are, I think, a lot of the pleasure of the book. And the way I kind of thought of it is if you're writing a kind of detective thriller, murder mystery kind of thing, well, the narrative pleasure comes from, I thought it was this guy who did the murder, but it's actually this guy. And I'm surprised, but delighted, because it's fun to be surprised. And in a sense, what the book is trying to do is to do that with history and say, you thought you were reading about this.
And I think that's true,
actually, you're reading about this.
Exactly. And that's what's so wonderfully fun about it and engaging about it, because it's a story. I mean, it's like reading, in some senses, it's a novel of sorts, if you go out there, how these things happened and how, what I want to talk to you, though, before we go any further, because this is something that just ideas, because this is a book about the story of ideas, really, and how they came to be. But talk to me, is there a scientific explanation on how we get our ideas and where they come from?
Well, that was really what I tried to do. I spent a lot more time talking about in Where Good Ideas Come From, that earlier book. The funny thing about it is I wrote a lot about this idea of the slow hunch in that book, which is the kind of the opposite of the eureka moment or the light bulb moment. And it was basically making the case that most really transformative ideas take a very long time to incubate, and they start as this kind of hunch, really, a feeling that there's something interesting, but you can't quite explain what's interesting about it. And it's people and it's organizations that are able to keep those hunches alive. Those people are actually the ones who end up having the most important ideas. Now, what's funny about that, and that shows up in a couple of places in how we got to now, the idea of the slow hunch. But the funny thing about that is after I'd finished writing Where Good Ideas Come From, I went back for some reason and read the book about neuroscience that I wrote, Mind Wide Open, which I wrote 15 years ago, or 14 years ago. And I was rereading it. I hadn't read it for years and years and years. And there's this whole riff at the very end of it about, I did all these brain scans on my own brain, actually. It was
really
recreational fMRI, which people don't do.
I want to try it.
And I had this whole riff in the book about how, what would be really interesting is if you could see somehow using these scanning technologies, a hunch taking shape in someone's brain, that kind of nebulous sense of possibility that you get when you have a hunch. Like, what would that look like in a brain scanner? And I had totally forgotten that I'd written this. And so the whole idea of the slow hunch turned out to be, in my own mind, a slow hunch. Like, it was so slow that I had forgotten entirely that I'd already had that idea like 6 years before.
That's hysterical. That's funny. But here's the deal. That seed, that germination, that moment, talk to me about that, because, I wonder sometimes, is it spiritual? Is it thoughtful? Is it what?
Yeah. Well, I often get this feeling, it's one of my favorite feelings when I'm in kind of research mode or just sitting around ruminating on things, where I have this feeling of, there's an interesting question there, or a field, or some topic, or something like that, and I don't know anything about it. But I know if I spent some time figuring out what the deal was with that thing, that it would be really, really interesting. And you suddenly become aware of a blank spot, basically, in your knowledge. Like a blank spot on the map of your knowledge. And there are blank spots on the map of your knowledge that you're so ignorant of that you don't even know that they're there. You don't see them. But sometimes the kind of interesting point is when you're like, there's this little zone here about some question that I don't know anything about. And I know it's going to take me a long time to fill that hole, but I'm sure that when I'm done filling it, it's going to really be interesting. And that's what leads me into so many things. I mean, that actually is the whole metaphor of the hummingbird effect from the opening of the book comes from me being in the middle of writing this book and writing in our house in California, and our garden there has all these hummingbirds. I was just there yesterday looking at some of them. And seemingly unrelated to the book, I just started thinking, like, what is the deal with hummingbirds anyway? They are really interesting. Like, they just behave like so differently from any other kind of bird. And like, look, they really do look more like insects than birds, and their wings are so intense, whatever. And so I started just like researching like the evolutionary history of hummingbirds just because I was interested in that. And then I started thinking, that's a really nice metaphor actually for the way that technology works in society. That could be good, But it was purely out of this feeling of like, there's something I don't know. I need to kind of dive into that and figure it out. And those are the things that I find really, I don't know if it's spiritual, but it's very like just intellectually exciting.
I think it's both myself, but that's just my opinion. But I also think that there's something interesting here, which is that some people, 1,000 billion ideas, and probably some of them new, go through their brains, and that's what they do. They go through their brains. And then there are people like you and the inventors who you're speaking about in the book who catch them, stay with them, and follow them through. That interests me.
Yeah. Well, part of it is, I've developed a lot of techniques over the years to do that. I actually wrote about this a year or two ago at Medium. I wrote this little series of some of my little tricks of the trade. But one of them was about this thing I've done for many years, which is I keep this single document where I write every random thought down. And it was a Word document. Now it's a Google document, so I can kind of get to it from whatever machine I'm on. I put like every random hunch for anything in this same document, just one long kind of chronological file. If it's an idea for a book or an idea for an essay or a speech or like an argument with my wife or whatever it is, I like throw it in there. And it's like 75,000 words long now, so it's longer than any of my books. It's just the main. And the big thing is that I try and reread the whole thing every 6 months, 9 months, or something like that.
Wow.
Because you just forget all these random things. And what happens is the idea that you had in 2007 actually didn't make a lot of sense in 2007 because you didn't understand a lot of other things, or the world wasn't ready for it, or whatever it is. But in 2014, whoa, it completely makes sense. You know where the idea goes for the first time, and you can actually put it to use. And so it's not, people write things down. I mean, it's not like I invented that, but I think it's really important to go back, one, to put them all in one place. Don't organize it. Don't spend any time organizing it.
Right.
Just like jot it down whenever it occurs to you, because the biggest threat, as you kind of implied, is like that you're going to forget these things because they don't have a natural home yet, or because they don't quite make sense yet, but they're the seeds of something, and so you have to like just get them in the ground,
right, right,
and keep going back to that little patch of ground and see if anything has grown.
I love that. It's fascinating with this book of yours and this concept of how we got to now, that we take a lot for granted in this world. Time does that to us. We don't have time to to always focus in. But your book proves it's much more fun to explore the evolution of an idea. So I have to ask you why you think so many aren't interested in the how and the why in the evolutions of ideas. I mean, I know you have your audience and, there are people who are, but there are a lot who aren't. And that makes me crazy. And I'm wondering, let me go off on a little tangent here with you. Is that a failure of education? Is it fear? Is this society abundantly lacking in curiosity?
But there's two funny things that I've noticed about this book since it came out, and the show too a little bit. So, like, if you look on Amazon, as I do, like every 3 seconds, like my sales ranking.
How my sales.
But Amazon shows you how you're doing all these categories too, so it'll find like the subcategory that you're doing the best in. So, and the book has been selling really well, so we're at the top of a lot of these categories. So like we've been at the top of like science, and we've been at the top of bizarrely philosophy, which is not really a book of philosophy, whatever. But they didn't even put it in history.
You got to be kidding.
It's like we're like in all these random. We're the number one book in political science. I'm like, what? It has nothing to do with political science. Like, there's one little bit about like Ronald Reagan getting elected, and that's the only thing about political science in it. But it's not in history. And the other thing, and I'll kind of relate these two, is a bunch of people, and I'm very flattered by this, but they say it reminds them of the series in the book Connections that was on the BBC and PBS starting in 1978 was the first Connections, and which kind of looked at history through a similar lens, and they are similar projects. But what I find amazing about it is that in thinking about this kind of historical storytelling, that to come up with particularly like a TV show that worked in this mode, you have to reach back to 1978.
Gee.
I think that the traditional storytelling mode of focus on biography of a great leader or a big military conflict or some aristocratic dynasty, all those things are great. And that's an important, God knows, kind of war is an important part of human history, but it's only part of it. And in many ways, the kind of things that I'm writing about and how we got to now, it seems to me like affect our lives in a much more kind of intimate day-to-day level than Mary Queen of Scots, And yet the history, both on TV and on the bookshelves is really dominated by that other kind of storytelling. And it's just kind of strange. So I think that's an education thing too, right? It's that, okay, you're going to go to your history class and you're going to learn, it's a classic joke about history. It's just one damn thing after another, It's kind of like, and then after the, like the first
yawn,
Elizabethan
right.
era, we had the second Elizabethan. And I think this kind of storytelling is actually kind of more fun. And two, it's just as important as that much more kind of familiar mode. So, hopefully we'll see more of it.
And also you will learn and not realizing you're learning, which is always fun because it's such an amazingly fun read. Let's get into the weeds a little bit. First of all, let's focus. There were 6 innovations that you're focusing on in the modern world in the book. Talk to me about them a little bit.
Yeah.
Just name them first, and then maybe we can do a couple.
Yeah, sure. So it's what we really wanted to have were topics and, in a sense, kind of objects that no longer seem to be technology. Like that they were old enough, familiar enough that we didn't think of them as something that really actually had to be invented even in the first place. And then to kind of, so, I definitely didn't want to have a chapter on, smartphones or something like that, And so they were, kind of almost, in some cases, kind of elemental things. So it starts with glass, which maybe is my favorite chapter actually. It's about the importance of the material glass to the last 1,000 years. And then there are chapters on light, artificial light, cold, and artificial kind of technologies of cold. All the sound technology is largely used to kind of either capture or amplify the sound of the human voice.
Can I say that? My favorite sound. I said my favorite sound, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. And clean, all about, kind of largely around clean drinking water, but our ability to keep things clean and our understanding of what it means for things to be clean. I can't remember, did I get them all?
Did you get them all? Let's see, we got glass, we got cold, we got sound, we got clean, we've got time and light.
Time, that was what I forgot. Yeah, time, which is my other favorite chapter. About our ability to measure time and clock making and so on.
Right. So if you're taking all of these and you have a favorite, but what is the most important of all of those that you think had the most relevant effect on us?
Well, I suppose I would say that, and this became clearer to me the more I kind of dove into the research for it, that in a way glass is that in a sense, if you, and I run through this in the book, that if you could somehow play, kind of tiny trick on the kind of laws of physics, basically, and cause the material that makes up glass, silicon dioxide, if you could just change one little thing in the universe and make it so that silicon dioxide did not transmit light, allow light to go through it the way that it does, so kind of beautifully when it's prepared properly. If you could change that one little feature, the entire history of human society over the last 1,000 years would be radically transformed. Because starting with, all the basic things that we think of, glasses and windows and things like that, but spectacles, which led to microscopes and telescopes, which, of course, revolutionized our understanding of our space and place in the universe, and most importantly, revolutionized health, because it enabled us to see the cell, enabled us to see ultimately viruses and bacteria. And then, of course, you would eliminate every glass lens, every camera, every television screen, fiber optics, the internet would go away. The internet on some crazy level is made out of glass because of the glass fibers and fiber optic cables. So it would just be a completely different society on just so many levels. The mirror, which had a huge role in the Renaissance and our understanding of the self, would have never been invented. Some of these things would have been possible in the 20th century, basically with plastics. We would have been able, once we got to the kind of knowledge we had in the 20th century, we would have been able to do some of these things. But we wouldn't have had, say, 500 years of telescopes and microscopes. So we'd have to suddenly we were discovering, the bacteria, in the middle of the 20th century instead of in the middle of the 19th century or, 16th century, as some of these things were discovered. So I think glass, in a way, that's why I put it right in the beginning, and also because no one ever thinks of that. I mean, people just don't think of glass as being all that important.
No, and I think that's the thing about, that was another part of this, that I just how you took it through, I guess it's the hummingbird effect, that you were taking everybody through into, A led to B to C to D to E, and then how, boom, it's like an explosion of how many, to me, that's just extraordinary. These inventors that came across your path in the research of all of this and how each person did whatever, was there something consistent in them that you found as to the kind of people that they were able to do this kind of invent?
I think the recurring theme in almost all of them is this kind of weird and semi-obsessive curiosity about the world, right? Yeah, the classic example is this guy Clarence Birdseye, who ultimately invents frozen foods and this process of flash freezing, which is crucial to frozen foods, but then ultimately becomes crucial to freezing human embryos. And there are millions of people who are alive today thanks to flash freezing. So it's a big technology. And he gets to this idea, again, a classic slow hunch, where he goes and he's living in Labrador and he goes ice fishing with these Inuits, and he's got a young kid. He's in Labrador in the winter, and he's trying to just keep, it's 1910. There's no food around. They're eating moose jerky. and he goes ice fishing, and they pull this fish out of the water, and it's so cold that the fish freezes instantly. And 2 days later, he thaws it out and cooks it and eats it, and he's like, that fish tasted so much better than any other frozen fish I've ever had in my life. That's amazing. Now, most of us at that point would say, well, that was a very tasty meal. I'm now going to bed. But Birdseye, because he had this crazy kind of curiosity about the world, was like, why was it so tasty? What was going on there? That was the best tasting frozen de-thawed, whatever fish I've ever had. And so he went on and did all these experiments, freezing all these different kinds of foods at different temperatures and so on. And it's that kind of series of experiments that ultimately led him to this breakthrough technology. And that's the way that people are. They just they stumble across something kind of interesting, and they can't not explore it. They're just drawn into trying to figure out what's going on in this strange phenomena they've observed. Distance with it too. I'm curious about it, and I'm going to stick with my investigation here and try and figure out what's going on.
Right. So curiosity is the mother of invention, I think it's fair to say. What about luck?
Oh my God, luck, and also there's a lot of failure, right? There's a lot of mistakes in the book.
I know. I was getting to that. I wanted to go. Let's play with that a little bit. Let's get into.
There's Lee DeForest, who kind of invents the vacuum tube, but doesn't really understand what he's doing when he's inventing the vacuum tube, and makes all these mistakes about how it actually works, and wildly overstates its abilities. Almost goes to jail briefly for kind of raising all this money on fraudulent terms for this invention, but he actually was kind of inadvertently had invented something important that once Bell Labs took over his patents and they started to investigate it, they discovered he totally misunderstood what he'd invented, but he had invented something useful, and that became the vacuum tube. which is, one of those certainly top 5 most important inventions of the first half of the 20th century. Made made radio possible, made early computers possible, and so on. And then this guy, Edward Leon Scott de Martinville, who invented recorded audio 20 years before Edison, but forgot to include the ability to play the audio that you had recorded.
I loved that one.
which turns out to be a feature that people actually like in their audio equipment.
A little minor detail, right?
Listen to it.
Right.
So you have, and I think that there's another kind of historical point here. The history of great ideas tends to be written by the victors, and we tend to focus on the people who, we like, people for whatever reason like to tell the story of and then he had the triumphant idea and he invented the telephone and the world was changed. And in fact, the actual history is messier and weirder and filled with all these, kind of missteps. But that's part of the process of human ingenuity, is through doing these kind of creative mistakes that end up slowly but surely, kind of advancing the space of possibility.
How about the craziest idea that worked?
Well, that's a good question. Well, probably the electrocutor in the ice trade. It was I'm going to take giant blocks of ice cut out of a frozen lake in New England and ship it to Rio and India without it melting and sell it to people because those places are really hot and they would like ice. And sure enough, he figured out a way to do it. And the thing I love about it is his biggest problem wasn't actually keeping the ice from melting. It was persuading people that they should actually pay for the ice once he got there, because they were like, what do I need ice for? They literally never seen ice.
Right, sure.
And they're like, what's a good, why we're perfectly happy here.
I think that's so funny.
Haven't you ever had a mint julep? He's like, come on, it's so nice.
Oh, I love that.
Full bath. Yeah.
I love that. Just briefly, because we really don't have time, but I have to ask you about creativity in terms of, does it warrant a discussion in all of this? Is it an art, a gift, something in our DNA, something we can be taught? Because all of this is creativity.
Yeah, for sure. That was the point that I was trying to make in that earlier book, Where Good Ideas Come From, that, I tried to look at, inventors and, jazz musicians. I was trying to make the point that creative people, whether they're technology people or they're artists, they actually have a bunch of things that are similar. And some of it is our personality, whatever that stew of DNA and upbringing. But I think it's also people's experiences, right? So, a lot of the people who are, another characteristic that they have, and curiosity obviously fuels this, is that they have a lot of hobbies. They're just interested in a lot of different things, and it's the diversity of their interests that ends up kind of creating these interesting sparks and new connections. Think about someone like Darwin, think about someone like Ben Franklin. These are people who, they were interested in a lot of different things, and there's always these, you see again and again in their lives, there's some little leap that they make because they're interested in X and Y, even though those two things seem unrelated. When you put them together, they create something new, something interesting. So there's some people, I suppose, who, for whatever reason, are more inclined to have hobbies, but that's also something you can choose, right? You can learn that. You can say, oh, right, creative people have a lot of interests. So I'm going to make sure that I, have side projects, and I'm not just focused on one exclusive thing. And inside an organization, you can say that too. You can say, listen, I want my employees to be focused on their responsibilities, but I also recognize that a lot of creativity comes from having different interests, and so I'm going to encourage them to be more diverse in what they think about or what they read or the kind of intellectual life they bring to the workplace, that it's not just singly focused on their one space on the org chart. So I think we can learn these things, that in a sense they improve our odds. It's just like sports, really. There's some people who, they're people who are never going to be a Major League Baseball player, but you can certainly make someone a better baseball player.
No question about that.
If you think about these things.
One other thing I wanted to get to before we close, and that is the fun facts in this book are just, people are going to be shocked when they pick this up and get some of the stuff like purifying water led to short skirts. What?
Yeah. Well, it was particularly swimsuit. So, once they started chlorinating the drinking water, which was a big breakthrough and a tricky one, because chlorine is a poison, right? If you drink pure chlorine, a couple glasses of it, you're not,
it's adios.
But a couple people, including this guy John Leal, figured out that very small doses of chlorine would be lethal to bacteria, but harmless to humans. So, kind of without getting anybody's permission, he did this big experiment where he chlorinated the drinking water in New Jersey, and it ended up having this amazing effect, a huge huge effect on infant mortality rates in the United States, cut them in half basically in 30 years. But it also meant that swimming was suddenly much safer because you could chlorinate the swimming pool water. And so after chlorination becomes widespread and kind of accepted as a practice, there's this huge explosion in the building of public swimming pools and in people learning how to swim. It was actually quite rare to know how to swim before the kind of turn of the century, 115 years ago. So all these people started swimming. So suddenly there were these places where people were in kind of bathing attire in public, where kind of fashions in bathing attire could kind of spread. There just weren't as many places, and people wouldn't hang out by water nearly as much. And during that period, exactly that period, there's a dramatic reduction, literally like the square kind of yardage of material in the average woman's bathing suit. and it goes from like, I don't know, it's in the book, I can't remember the numbers, like the average suit was like 9 yards of material and it went to 2 in the space of like 20 years.
I love it.
And, other things are contributing to that. There's, kind of interesting proto-women's liberation movements in the 20s, kind of jazz culture and the beginning of Hollywood and stuff like that. But the fashions in bathing suit wearing wouldn't have had a kind of a place to spread visually if it weren't for the building of all these public pools. And so, part of the point here is, there are multiple factors, but we always already assume that Hollywood is shaping women's fashion. We never talk about, chlorine or like chemicals like having any effect on women's fashion. And in fact, it was part of the story.
Oh my God. I can only tell my audience that just how delightful he is in talking. That delight is in this ridiculously terrific book. Who would have thought? I'm telling you. I just love this book so much. How We Got to Now, 6 Innovations That Made the Modern World. Before we close, I want to ask you this. You say in How We Got to Now that geniuses of invention often work at the margins of their fields or at the intersection point between different disciplines. A lesson that you say lends much to our understanding of creativity and innovation. Geniuses, a little crazy? What?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, you get all these people. I love these people kind of profiled in this book. I've gotten kind of very attached to them. But yeah, like half of them were kind of nutty. A significant number of them, were thrown into prison in one form or another, and were widely, kind of ridiculed by their peers. But they ended up changing the world somehow through all of that.
So the future in the how?
What was that?
The future in the how?
In the how?
Mm-hmm.
What is the future?
I mean,
that I don't know.
I think it is. It's always in the how. It's always in the how, right? Yeah, that's my point. Yeah. It's always in the how. I've been speaking with Steven Johnson, author of and host of the PBS series of the same name, How We Got to Now, 6 Innovations That Made the Modern World. For more information on Steven Johnson and his ideas, visit his website at StephenBerlinJohnson.com and become one of his many Twitter followers at Stephen B. Johnson. Barbara Erenreich is an American writer and political activist who describes herself as a mythbuster by trade and has been called a veteran muckraker by The New Yorker. She is a widely read and award-winning columnist and essayist and author of 21 books, perhaps best known for her 2001 book, Nickel and Dimed, on Not Getting By in America, a memoir of Ehrenreich's 3-month experiment surviving on a minimum wage. Now from the New York Times bestselling author comes a brave, frank, honest, and exquisitely written memoir that is sure to rattle your world. In Living with a Wild God, a non-believer's search for the truth about everything, Ehrenreich, an impassioned atheist, reconstructs her childhood, adolescent, mystical experience that was so strange, so cataclysmic, that she never in all the intervening years wrote or spoke about it, if only because she was afraid of being judged insane. Rediscovered while she was receiving chemotherapy for breast cancer, Living with a Wild God reads like a metaphysical thriller. So I want to start with your childhood, Barbara. I mean, if you would give us an overview, I think that would certainly prove helpful, I think, in our discussion of this powerful, powerful memoir of yours, Living with a Wild God, Non-Believers Search for the Truth About Everything. Talk to me.
Well, I was born in Butte, Montana, which in itself is distinctive, and that was a copper mining city at the time I was born, and most of the men in my family were really worked in the copper mines or they were railroad workers. So it was it was a blue-collar setting. But there's also something very distinctive about Butte, which I never quite put my finger on entirely historically, but it was very much a union town with lots of labor strife, and it was also a place where apparently you could get away with a certain amount of nonconformity. My family members, certainly by my parents' generation, were very strong atheists, which took a little bit of guts because Butte was overwhelmingly a Catholic city. But that's how I was raised, by people who had a blue-collar background and who were strong, dogmatic atheists. So don't even go there. It doesn't make any sense. And it's an odd thing to absorb as a child.
I'll
what
bet.
Everybody else believes could be untrue.
Yeah, I can't even imagine that. Your dad, and you got into science. Explain that whole.
Well, he wanted to be a scientist. When he started out as a miner, managed to get a degree in the one place of higher education at that time in Butte, which was the Butte School of Mines. So it was a degree like in metallurgy or that sort of thing. And then he got a doctor's degree, too, but he ended up being wooed into management and not doing science. So it was as if he had decided I was going to have to be the scientist. And he did a lot to make me interested. He also did a lot to turn me off on it because he was the smartest man in the world, as he himself could attest to. And nobody was as smart as him, certainly not I. So if you didn't catch on to something really fast, you were going to get a huge put down. So he was a complicated figure in my life. And I did feel, I've got to be a scientist. I guess that's what you should do if you want to do something with dignity in this world.
And that's what you did. You pursued science in college.
I did. I pursued it in all directions.
You're a good little girl, I have to tell you, right?
Yes, thank you very much.
Can't say you're a good Catholic girl. I have to say you're just a good girl.
No, you can't say that.
I love it. Okay. All right. Now, Birth of a Child Transforms thing, as I'm reading your bio, and in 1970, you underwent a pretty strong personal transformation. You got involved with the political health movement and wrote an underground bestseller, which is Midwives and Nurses, A History of Women Healers. Something new.
That's right. Have you ever read it?
I haven't, but I knew of it.
Yeah, it was. It's now published by the Feminist Press.
Mm-hmm.
But when Deirdre English and I wrote it, what was it, 71, 72? We self-published.
Early.
We just, we're putting out like a political manifesto. We've done this history research. We want to control it. And we made a beautiful pamphlet with pictures. We've got the illustrations, got the permission for them, and came out with which is Midwives and Nurses. Now, I had just had my second child, and my job was to fulfill our orders for it as it came in. People would write to us because we could get a lot of advertisement. We had a lot of publicity in the underground press at the time. And I used to pack those copies of Witches, Midwives, and Nurses in my Pampers boxes and send them out around the country.
My kind of gal. I like a girl who's innovative and intrepid and goes for it. Now, you were teaching, right? A couple of years later, you shift gears and you abandon your teaching career and you put your considerable talents to becoming a full-time writer. Not an easy thing when you've got kids, right? We know how
this was a stupid decision.
Yeah, well, look what it got you.
And then I have no job. And then I decided, I'd be a writer.
Tough time, right?
Well, then I could do it. Today, it would be impossible. At the time, that was before the internet, I was paid enough by magazines so that I could pretty much, with help from child support, take care of my family. Couldn't do that today.
No way. No, this is something in your bio that also, I loved. Where you bill yourself as a journalist who focuses on themes related to social injustice and inequality, as well as an activist. But you've never seen a conflict in this, and I love this. As a journalist, you search for the truth, and as a moral person, you say you're obliged to do something about it.
To do something,
I love that.
Well, I as a journalist, just as when I was a scientist, what you're looking for is the truth. And you can't you're not writing propaganda. You can't write what you want. You can't make people nice or mean according to your ideology. So you're going for the truth. But when you think you have that, and it's shocking and horrifying, you've got to get involved. Plus, which I will admit, in years of writing often about these issues, I've learned a lot from being, on picket lines, talking to people who are experiencing the things I was writing about, seeing how people organize against injustice. So for me, they're kind of inseparable.
It's that truth that you always seek that I find so fascinating about who you are and what you write. And that takes us to where we are today with this seriously, I said it. It's an extraordinary, powerful memoir that you've written in Living with a Wild God. We'll talk about that in a minute. A non-believer's search for the truth about everything, and it is a bit of a departure for you, though.
Oh, it's totally a departure.
but how honest could you be to even bring, oh my gosh. I mean, it's so honest. But it started as a book of religion, and your editors didn't want you to go there?
No, I wanted to write a history of religion, which in a sense pretty arrogant, and that's me. I'm an independent scholar. I don't have a university or anything like that. And I just got very fascinated by the rise of monotheism and began to have all kinds of theories and putting a lot of things together. And my agent basically said, "This is so academic. Can you make it have more narrative?" Now, in fact, I could, because there were things that had happened to me in my life that touched on things that are normally the property and territory of religion. And I sort of wanted to acknowledge that, but I want to put it in the footnote somewhere. However, I had, as it turns out, I knew I had it, but I hadn't looked at it, a journal I had kept as a teenager, which had followed me all these years. It had always been gone with me with every move. It was in a pretty large envelope of individual scraps of paper. Each one was an entry. And I knew that, that there was the story was somehow had to be teased out of that. The story of, I'll say the word, it's mystical experiences. And I say that word with kind of a shudder because, I am an atheist. I am an unbeliever. It's nothing to do with belief, just odd things that have happened.
This comes to you, this project, at a very interesting time in your life, right? As you said, you had survived 48 years carrying this little thing, give or take a few, around with you, this envelope that had this sort of secret personal experience in it that had happened to you as a child and that you were keeping to yourself. Mm-hmm. Why?
Why was it a secret?
Yeah.
Well, how can you say something like that? I mean, that's why I said I shudder even now saying those words, because mystical seems to me such a dodgy word. I really, I don't like things that you can't say I'm a master with science or reason, and we haven't done that, frankly. I am an ardent atheist, but I think the mistake or the shortcoming of some of the, quote, new atheists, or all men, have is that they don't acknowledge that there are experiences that can drive people toward religion. See, when I began to look at this as a mature person and reread my journal and put it in order and transcribe it and so on, I realized this is very common. They're not something unique to me. Many, many people have had mystical experiences, and I ignored them because often they're writing in a religious way, and they're attributing it to God, which I can't do, and have no reason to.
So when you say mystical, before we go further with this, maybe do you want to describe what it was? How do you couch that in that term mystical? Because mystical is many things to many different people, right? Is that why you chose that word?
Well, it's not a great word, but it meant that there's something that does not reduce easily to words.
Okay. Now,
I did my best in this book, Living with a Wild God, to describe the circumstances and as clearly as I can what it was like, and which was a feeling of, this is all I can do to say,
right.
As if the whole world had come to life. Every single thing was on fire, was breathing, was reaching out, it was flowing through me or flowing away from me or whatever it was doing. And this is the most powerful thing that ever happened to me. I
can well imagine.
Consciousness, I didn't fall down so far as I know. and I sort of continued my regular life, but it was almost shattering. It was so overwhelming.
And as this book begins, you're 59 years old and you're battling breast cancer. And I
wouldn't say battling.
Okay.
I was
Well, you won.
in a bad mood about it.
Yeah, I love you. You're my kind of girl. This is so interesting to me, though. But this is to go through that experience is such an amazing experience and such a reflective time. Anyway, it kind of compels you into reflection. You don't know what the future is going to bring, and you may not make it to as long as you thought you were going to make it. Mm-hmm. And it forces you almost to look at the boogeyman in the map of our lives. I think was that what forced you to open up and finally about this? Do you think?
Well, there was a conjuncture of things. I was undergoing treatment, chemotherapy, which I would never do again. Mm. And at the same time, somebody came down from the Schlesinger Library at Harvard to go through my papers, which I was donating to them. And the reason I was donating them was, unfortunately, they weren't giving me any money, but I lived in the lower Keys, the Florida Keys. And it's an environment that's completely hostile to paper. Paper does not last. It gets ruined with the humidity. And so we're going through these papers with this nice lady, and that's when I saw this envelope that I'd been carrying around all my life and snatched it up before the librarian could find it. Not that she was particularly nosy, and said, "This is for me. This is not going in any library. I haven't even read through this, and I don't know how long I will live, but I'm going to go through. I'm going to return to this at some point."
And this is what I found mystical. Okay, if we believe that life is a learning experience, and you're going through one of those great learning experiences, right? At this there's an irony in this, that in the fact that life gave you a little choice, but to pursue a why at this particular time. And you're searching for something in all of this, right? An explanation other than nothing. That's how don't call it religion, just an explanation. You're a non-believer. To me, this is almost spiritual.
Well, yes, I really, that word makes me cringe, but because it's even worse than mystical. But how was I to explain this experience in my life? Now, what I had done for most of these intervening decades is, all right, it was probably some kind of mental breakdown, or maybe there's some neurophysiological basis we will understand someday. I read all things about schizophrenia, which was really the only mental illness available when I was a teenager. Now we have many more, I think. And I couldn't integrate it into my rationalist scientific viewpoint. And, so in this book, actually, it comes out with a new look at science. I come out being critical of science, but having no use whatsoever for any kind of personified God or any God at all.
Well, we're going to get to that in a second. I want to go back to more irony, and that is you, the outspoken atheist. The title of the book, Living with a Wild God.
My wonderful editor, Deb Futter, at 12 books. For that. It was a chapter title because I kind of liked the sound of it. And she said, this has to be the title of the book. Well, that has got me into a certain amount of trouble because people have looked at that and said, oh, well, she must have found God. And, my family is atheist. I got in a lot of trouble with my own sister. What are you writing about God for? And so
but I think
I've been ambivalent about it, but I still like the sound of it.
But the term wild God, talk to me about that.
Well, I sort of, at the end of the book, speculatively kind of allow myself to consider the possibility that what had happened to me that seemed to be a, quote, mystical experience was actually some kind of encounter with something. And I throw this out very carefully. I read some very strange things preparing for this, writing this book. Like I read a lot of the Christian mystics. And that's not the kind of thing that scientists, a person like me, reads. But I could see parallels between what they described and what happened to me, as if you take out words like God.
Right. Perfect sense. I mean, of course. Yeah. I mean, but is that a label, God, anyway? I mean, in some senses, it's interpretive.
It emphasizes that if there is some other that I encountered, it is not a moral being.
Not a moral being. Okay.
It has nothing to do with human morality.
That's interesting. I want to go back to that mystical experience because I think there's something in this that I would like to discuss. And you brought up, you might have been schizophrenic because that was the only way people were labeled if, you were crazy, this, that, and the other thing. Yeah, I think you even just mentioned there could be a biological reason for what occurred and all of that. I mean, we can go 1,000 different ways. Mm-hmm. But let me try
I give the evidence for all these kinds of things. I was alienated from my family and from high school. Well, who isn't? And the specific physical conditions that sort of precipitated. This involved not really eating for a couple of days or sleeping, not on purpose, but just that's how it happened. So, I'm saying all of these things feed into it, but there is still the subjective experience, which I have, done my best to share here.
Okay, but let me let me take it out a step further. Why not religion? And let me do this. Do we put more weight on scientific data than spiritual data? And is that fair or honest?
Well, I think, let me answer the second first. Okay. Is that, to me, it's a shortcoming of science if it does not accept some things as worthy of investigation. To say, oh, well, that's just like off the charts, that's too weird for us, that's not science. As I said, what finally drove me to write this book in a way, it was the sense that there had to be some way to come at this rationally. That I, as a rational person, had to explore every possibility. And that to just push it aside and say, that was mental, that was crazy, that's not scientific. Because if science is anything, it's empirical. You gotta take the data. You gotta take what happens. And I think there's also an influence here of feminism. Because a big emphasis in the second wave of feminism, and I was around for some of the beginnings of that, was on valuing your own experience. Don't let somebody, some man, some expert tell you and label everything and tell you what it is, or dismiss it as unimportant. A lot of the feminist battle has been to take seriously our experience and get the world to take it seriously, men to take it seriously.
Right. But the other question that I had is why not one of the answers be that it could have been a religious experience?
You mean that I could have had an encounter with God?
Well,
like a monotheistic God?
Well, any kind of God. I mean, there's more than just monotheism out there. I mean,
I can't see that. I mean, usually when we talk about God, we mean a loving presence in the universe,
and paternal,
intrinsically moral, loving presence that will, punish crime or at least reward goodness. And, in some of the Christian extremes, it's even a being that loves us and looks out for us personally. I have absolutely no evidence of that, of anything like that. And I defy you to see a pattern of cosmic love in nature or human history.
It's interesting to me that we all, in some ways, a lot of us, most of us, there are, of course, the exception to the rule, wind up believing what we're taught as children. You were raised an atheist, you're an atheist. I was raised a Jew, I'm a Jew. I mean, you know what I'm saying? There's very few people who back away from their early teachings. You agree?
I don't know. I can't say that I've done a survey. Certainly a lot of people in my life were once Catholics and rebelled.
But remain, quote unquote, and I'm going to put it in quotes because it's not fair because Catholics or somebody would say they're not Christians, but stay within the realm of religion of some sort.
No, not at all.
No? You have friends who've left?
No. People who become atheists become disgusted with religion. And I've known, in my case, I've known mainly lost Catholics in that category, but there are certainly a lot of Protestants.
I have friends who've gone from Christianity to Judaism. I've had friends who are Jewish and gone to Christianity, that kind of thing. But I haven't had anybody say, that's it, I'm done, no more, there's no God, that I know of in the orbit.
I have to introduce you to some people.
Yeah, I'd like to, because I find this atheism absolutely fascinating, because I think there's a lot of it's smart, it's rational, it's much more courageous, I think, than those of us who
there's no comfort in this.
Well, right. So I think there's a lot of courage in it. Is there a fear that to prove the existence of a God or spiritual world, that it would somehow be the death of science? Does that play into this at all?
Oh, no. I think science, the deficits of science are pretty clear, or should be now. And I point them out very fleetingly. Like, it was only about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, that biological science in general, officially acknowledged that non-human animals have feelings, there's so much they have now that are in common with us. Emotions, can make plans in some cases, have cultures. Science has said, and this goes back to Descartes in the 16th century, correct me if I'm wrong, that animals are things. They are objects. They have no flicker of mind as we do. Now that's plain wrong. And that's looking at the world and not seeing, living things around us, not understanding. Something very, very basic. I think we're kind of reformed now, but I think that was like a grave mistake.
Fascinating. Let me throw this out. It's more of a devil's advocate question than anything else, but I'm curious as to what you have to think about. You have, quote unquote, something, religion, if you will, in a family life. The kids read these Bible stories or, been given these Bible stories, whatever it is that I'm not sure an atheist gets, but it gives a child a sense of possibility in the imaginative sense, even if it's not the literal sense. Tell me about that with growing up as an atheist.
Oh, well, I don't think there was any shortage of imagination in my childhood or in the family. There were these were blue-collar people. My mother went to college in her 50s, so she was, it was not a college-educated environment, but there were books and books of poetry, books of
and possibility,
complete works of Edgar Allan Poe.
Right.
I read the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Because my parents, for some reason, had it, which is a very anti-religious document. Very beautiful, too.
Beautiful document.
So I read Greek and Norse mythology.
And the possibility, I guess that's where I'm going. I want to see if the possibility is open. How is it different for a child who grows up as an atheist versus somebody who grows up in quote unquote organized religion? There's always an avenue. Yes?
Well, what do you mean by possibility of what?
Well, possibility of things that are out of the norm, even that there is this out there. With God, we have a sense of bigger than life. Heaven out there, hell down there. What?
Well, if there was a substitute or any kind of equivalent in my childish intellect, it was the possibility of knowing more and more and understanding more about the world. And as my father impressed on me the way you had to understand was through chemistry, physics, and so on.
Total thought.
But I always knew there were things that they were not coming close to because of all my reading and the kind of understanding. But I always had the sense that I could know if I kept trying. Not know scientifically, but know in some way what is going on here. And by that I mean, what is this about, this world, this life we have?
I love it.
So I was totally infused with a sense of possibility and mission.
Should science and religion coexist? Can they coexist?
No. I mean, I don't, challenge people who are religious and say you can't even think straight if you're religious. I'm not challenging you or anything, but I think the effort to reconcile them is a major, major mistake.
Because
I will continue to argue and try to convert people to my non-theistic point of view. But, it would be a mistake to just say, let's compromise. Religion is here and science is over there, which was sort of the compromise thrown out by Stephen Jay Gould, the famous biologist in the 70s, that they're not overlapping, so they should leave each other alone.
Can we learn one from the other, though?
Huh?
Can we learn from each other? Not me, but meaning, can religion learn from science, and can science learn from religion?
Only if science is studying religion. Science is not about finding other, creatures in the world whose existence cannot be proved. Science is so sociable. It's about what can I prove that is absolutely does not depend on you're sharing any beliefs with me. If I keep measurements of something and are able to tell you the temperature every day here in Northern Virginia, maybe you would be convinced of some theory I had, or maybe not. But you wouldn't have to have the same experiences or any beliefs about the weather in Northern Virginia.
You still having these experiences?
They're much pleasanter now, I would say. Nothing so intense. Now it's more like like being overwhelmed suddenly by the beauty of things and kind of silenced. I wouldn't call this rapturous, though sometimes it is a little bit, but it's certainly not shattering like that time I describe.
I love that. So at the end of Living with the Wild God, you write that your Aunt Marcia detected this tiniest quaver of evasion when an interviewer asked about atheism. Did you waver?
Well, I felt a little, I didn't just like going on saying, I'm an atheist anymore. And partly because I was, in my mind, already critical of the so-called new atheists who were some of my contemporaries, some older. And I wanted to leave the door open here for some possibilities of being critical of science and saying that, look, there are experiences that we can't account for yet in detail, but we should share them and try to figure them out.
I love it. There's a wonderful African word, okasaboka, and it means possibilities. I don't know about you, but I'm open to it. I've been speaking with New York Times bestselling author Barbara Erenreich about her new memoir, Living with a Wild God, a non-believer's search for the truth about everything, by way of 12, an imprint of Grand Central Publishing. For more information on Barbara and her work, visit her website, barbaraerenreich.com. Before I go, I want to remind everyone that podcasts of current and past shows are always available to listen to free on iTunes under the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is also available for download via Spreaker.com, Stitcher.com, blogtalkradio.com, and a host of other venues. Google the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, and you will find us. Of course, podcasts of our shows, both past and present, are always posted for your listening pleasure at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, which I hope you'll visit often for the latest information on our upcoming segments. Oh, and while you're at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, don't forget to visit my blog to read my latest musings. I'll be back next week, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, for another edition of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, Talk Radio for Fine Minds, brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Audible.com features over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Stay in touch, won't you? Remember, that's HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Discover us on Facebook at Halli Casser-Jayne and on Twitter at HalliCJ. I love to hear from you. So, till we meet again, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. It's a wrap.